This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Tourism is an evergreen topic in many countries, and Vietnam is certainly no exception. Statistically, it's on its way to a record-breaking year, with 10.7 million international arrivals recorded in the first half of the year, up 21% year-on-year. That puts Vietnam on its way to hit its target of 22 to 23 million international tourists for the year. That would be a new record. After years of wondering why the country was so far behind Thailand, which is, for better or worse, considered the regional benchmark, some media outlets here are now wondering when Vietnam could overtake it, especially as Thailand is facing some of its own troubles. Generally lost amid the exuberant local coverage recently of these figures is the potential impact of ever more tourism, even as enormous upcoming projects, largely aimed at tourism, risk massive environmental damage in places like Kenya and Cat Ba. But I don't mean to be a total downer. When done well, tourism can, of course, improve local livelihoods and boost the overall economy. But that done well aspect is critical, of course, and today's guest has done a lot of work on that topic over the years. Joshua Zukas is a travel writer who has been based in Vietnam for over a decade, writing guidebooks, creating audio tours, and contributing stories to publications like The Economist. His latest guidebook on the country, for Bradt Guides, will be published later this month. We discussed the process of writing a comprehensive guidebook on such a fast-changing country, unique aspects of the book, such as its focus on Vietnamese myths, the risks of overtourism in places like Hoi An and Sapa, favorite lesser-known spots to visit, and more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Joshua. Josh, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, and congrats on the book, by the way, which is one of the big reasons why you're here. And I thought we could start with just kind of what it's like to research and write, a full comprehensive guidebook in this day and age.
Yeah, so writing a guidebook for anywhere, I think, is not easy. I think mainly because you have to wear so many hats. So you have to be a historian, an anthropologist, a linguist, a foodie, a travel consultant, obviously. Guidebooks are inherently comprehensive, which means that the author has to be kind of a generalist. So you have to become knowledgeable about areas that you might not naturally find that interesting. So for me, that's things like Vietnam's geology or sports, which appears in the introductory sections, which are not of interest to me, but will be of interest to some readers, or things like hotel listings. If I never have to write another hotel review again, it will still be too soon.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's very rewarding. I think that no other travel writing assignment gets you under the skin of a country like writing a guidebook. There's a Substack I follow called Talking Travel Writing by two travel writers, Steph Dyson and Lottie Gross, and they've got a series on guidebooks at the moment. And in a recent newsletter, they made a really convincing case for why authoring a guidebook makes you a better travel writer. I think it forces you to really get to know a place in its entirety. You can't do the job and just skim the surface. But writing a guidebook for somewhere like Vietnam, I think, is even harder. And that's because things just, as you know, you live in Saigon. So, things just change so quickly and so often. Perhaps in some European countries, for example, it's possible to visit somewhere once and cover it sufficiently for the purposes of a guidebook. But, that's not the case in Vietnam. I think that you need to go somewhere several times to get a sense of what sites and restaurants and cafes and bars might stick around and what might disappear. Because, otherwise the guidebook will go out of date very quickly. I spent 2 years researching and writing the book. And during that time, I went up and down the country several times. In the book, I say that it's more times that I can count, but I think it was around 6 times, just moving up and down and up and down.
Wow. Okay.
But I was also able to draw an experience from before that because I've been, before I started the guidebook, I'd already been involved in Vietnam for 15 years. I first came in 2007, 2008.
Mm.
Um, so that means that most of the places I cover in the guide, I've been to them, at least a handful of times. And I think for Vietnam, that is crucial. So yeah, I think that yeah, the short answer is it's difficult. Writing the guidebook is difficult.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I've over the years I've been approached a couple times about maybe contributing to some, and it just hasn't happened. I think in part because it is just a lot of work.
Mm.
And I mean, you mentioned how quickly things change, and I guess this year maybe has been particularly bad timing for someone like yourself, with districts now officially no longer exist, and I mean half the provinces were merged into others, which I can imagine was maybe a bit of a nightmare because you had basically finished the book, I assume, when that happened.
Yeah, that was very frustrating.
I'm sure.
But I could only laugh. It's
Yeah.
just like it just felt so I don't know, typical.
Yeah. And I did want to get into the book a little bit, obviously. So, in the introduction, you start, which is not particularly long, so it's not like that took forever to read. But you start off, conveying the beauty and the dynamism of Vietnam, which are both very real, certainly. But then devote the last couple of paragraphs to sort of acknowledging that there are real flaws. Every country has flaws, and advise readers to accept the bad with the good, which there's plenty of both of those, I think. Was that an attempt to kind of correct depictions you've seen elsewhere, or where did that come from?
Yeah, so I've I've always thought that good travel writing should manage expectations. Um, I don't think it's helpful for anyone to paint an idealized picture of a place, somewhere with just like beautiful beaches and pristine countryside and untouched mountains and so on, without mentioning problems, problems like trash management or environmental degradation. Travel media is, of course, guilty of ignoring these issues, or can be guilty of ignoring these issues. And I have struggles compromising with editors about being honest when sometimes that means writing something that the reader may not be happy reading. But I think travel writers, we're not the same as travel influencers. You know, I want I want my readers to be informed about a place. I don't want them to be manipulated and influenced. I think that leads to a more fulfilling experience of the country. And ultimately, I think that's better for the traveler, but also the place that they're visiting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I found, in flipping through the book, I think there was a section in the Queen Yan chapter, or section, where you mentioned how there's a lot of beautiful, basically unvisited beaches in the area, but they might be filthy. I think was the exact word used. Which, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate but
Mm.
true.
I think I say trash
Trash
covered,
covered, okay.
but yeah,
Which,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, and again, this is not unique to Vietnam. I know sometimes, and I mean, social media is a mess, but sometimes if you see someone sort of being maybe realistic about how things are in certain places, they can kind of get shouted down either by other foreigners or perhaps residents. But I totally agree. You do. I don't think you want people showing up to. Phuoc, I guess, maybe is an example, which I think we'll probably talk a little bit about later on. But if you go there expecting some untouched, forest laden, pristine island, you're going to be shocked by a lot of what you see, probably.
yeah, exactly. I think I've spoken about this before on another podcast, but it sometimes feels like it's a bit of a bait and switch, like travel media and the tourism board kind of present this Vietnam that doesn't really exist, and then when travelers arrive, they learn that and realize that, and then I think it sometimes leaves a bad impression. And, that might be one reason why Vietnam has quite poor return rates, is because what they're getting isn't what they were promised.
And now, in our talks before, when we were planning the show, you mentioned a few things you're particularly proud of in the book. For example, there's a few sections that have contributions from Vietnamese writers. There's a focus on, I definitely want you to expand on this part, but a lot of about Vietnamese myths and legends. That's kind of a through line through the book. Another big part, you have a section about why you didn't fly. You took no domestic flights for any of this. And I'm assuming a lot of people listening are familiar with Vietnam, but for some areas, that means a long train or bus trip, I suppose, as the alternative. And you use diacritic for the Vietnamese names. I think other than Hanoi and Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, which also is quite rare in travel writing or any writing about Vietnam, in English at least. So why were these? I realize that's kind of a lot of ground, but why were these important to you?
Yeah, okay. Shall I go through them one by
Sure.
one then?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you mentioned 4 things. Okay, so let's start with local contributions. So yeah, this is really important to me, and not just with the guidebook. I think that's important to my work in general. So when writing articles, I always prioritize local voices for interviews, and I push editors to commission local photographers and fixers instead of parachuting people in. I think that local perspective is so important in making the story as good and useful and as honest as it can be. But I mean, it's also a way of supporting and nurturing local talent, I think. When it comes to the guidebook, um, I've been in Vietnam for a long time, but I'm still very aware that I'm a foreigner and that I formulate ideas about the country through a Western lens. And, sometimes this is useful. Most of my readers are likely to be from Western countries, and being an outsider grants me some objectivity. But it also comes with a lot of preconceptions. I come with a lot of preconceptions, and I didn't want that to negatively impact on the work. And I thought that getting a local perspective would help with that. I also wanted to protect against unknowingly offending 100 million people, which I'm sure is something that you're thinking about a lot too.
Sure. Yeah.
So I employed a research assistant early on, the journalist Lam Nguyen, and she read every word of the guide to give me some ideas about what should and shouldn't be in there. So, Lam, I hope you're listening, but the guide is so much better because of your help. So thank you. I also spoke about controversial topics and bounced ideas off my partner, Bian, much to his annoyance, I'm sure, because this went on for 2 years, more than 2 years, actually. And both of them actually contributed information boxes in the book. So Lam wrote a passage about bamboo diplomacy. I'm not sure if you saw it.
Yep.
Bian contributed a myth from the Central Highlands and some photos as well, actually. And I also had some other local contributions, which I'm really happy are in the book. So Lian, a friend and an academic and a language teacher in Hanoi, she contributed one of my favorite boxes, which is about mother goddess worship in the Red River Delta, which is her area of expertise. And another box I'm really happy with was written by somebody called Me, which she's a Hmong tour guide in Sapa. And she was able to contribute a box about the Zaj. I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't speak Hmong, but it's spelled Z-A-J. Or that's how she spelt it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of like dragon spirits.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really happy with that. And yeah, and also, I shouldn't forget Zuyen. So she's an academic and Cham expert at the Cham Museum in Da Nang. And she didn't write them, but she very kindly looked over all of my sections, because I have a lot of sections about Cham art and history, and she was able to look through all of them for me and give me ideas and comment on where she thinks I should expand and fact check too. So that was really helpful. And yeah, then there's of course Tom from Vietnam Coracle.
Yes.
An excellent website that I'm sure many of your listeners use. And he wrote the chapter on Phu Quoc and Con Dao. And he
Nice.
knows these islands better than I ever will. And Tom, he may not be Vietnamese, but he can certainly claim to be somewhat of a local. And yeah, I really feel that the book is so much better because of all of these local contributions. Yeah, sorry, I went on and on. What was the next thing? Oh, yeah.
No, it's okay. The myths, which I mean, the contribution from the Hmong woman feeds into as well, actually.
Yeah, right, yeah. So, like, if you're familiar with my work, then you know that I really love a good story. And, when that story relates to a place that you're exploring or learning about, I think it's even better. So the book has around 50 legends, I think, something like that.
Mm.
And they're all in themed information boxes, which I've called Legend Has It, so that, you can quickly find them in the book. And, Vietnam is so full of legends and stories. And I think learning a bit about them really enhances the experience of traveling in the country. So, like, for example, you see Guan everywhere in Vietnam. In English, we usually call her Guan Yin from the Chinese, or just like Lady Buddha. She's the big white statue that you see on the Sơn Chao Peninsula, from Da Nang Beach. Um, but I think for so many visitors, that's all she is. She's just a statue. But like a curious traveler would ask, like, why do so many Vietnamese pagodas have a female Buddha? Like, where did she come from? Um, and she has a great story, kind of grounded in mythology. And I think knowing that story, it makes coming across her, and being in her presence just so much more powerful. And I think that that's true, for other things. Like, it's also true for the goddess Tien Hậu, who you'll find in many of the Chinese assembly halls in Hoi An and Saigon and Hanoi, actually, in the old quarter. There's one at least. And, she's got a great story as well.
Mm.
And there's also the four immortals, who are just about everywhere and referenced constantly in the Vietnamese mythos. And I really feel that if you know the stories behind these beings that you encounter when you're in Vietnam, it just makes the temple, wherever you see them, the places that you see them, makes the temples, the mountainsides, the cities, it just makes encountering them just so much more engaging if you know who they are and what their story is.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I think could be foregrounded much more in what have you, tourism promotional materials, or even just, yeah, I don't know, signs or plaques at some of these places. Because I've also been here a long time, and I, perhaps this is my own ignorance, but I'm unfamiliar with pretty much all of those. I mean, I know with How Long Bay, you'll hear, like the Bay of the Descending Dragon, or what some, maybe I got that slightly wrong, but that one is relatively well known. But outside of that, I've kind of missed all of that, and I'm going to assume that's probably true for a lot of other people as well.
Yeah, it does. For me, it does feel like a missed opportunity because, yeah, like you say, there's so much, and they are, and they are, when you know where to look, they are everywhere. Yeah, I think that there could be more. People could do more to educate visitors to Vietnam about these legends and myths. And the interesting thing is like, in my experience, all Vietnamese people know them. You know, like,
Yeah.
you'll point at a statue in Saigon and be like, "Who is that?" And they'll be like, "Oh, that's Tang Dong," and then they'll tell you the
Right.
story about Tang
Hmm.
Dong. And they know it. They all know it. And so I think it's, I really like this about Vietnam, that like Vietnamese people, they, I think that they all seem to kind of know about, in my experience at least, I can only speak anecdotally, but they seem to know about all of these myths and legends, and it's a really nice thing to talk about with Vietnamese people.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then so yeah, I'll go back through the four things I mentioned, but the not flying at all, which in this age of, a new airport expansion being announced on a weekly basis, it seems like, or a new airline being announced every few months, more or less, in Vietnam. I mean, that's a bit retro, for lack of a better word. So what drove that decision?
Yeah. So, yeah, in the guide, I promote a version of slow travel, where you're not flying from place to place. I I accept that that's not practical and realistic for everybody for all sorts of reasons. So there is still information in there about where there are airports and, flying from place to place, but I don't front it. So in the transport sections, the by air section is always last, and that's for two reasons. So one is that not flying domestically is probably the best way that you can reduce your carbon footprint while in the country. So after you've arrived in Vietnam, however you've got there, if you don't take a domestic flight, you're already doing so much better than many others. And I think, considering Vietnam is one of the countries bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, I think that that's just worth thinking about. But the second reason is that I think not flying actually makes for a better travel experience. Vietnam is a long, thin, diverse country. And I think part of the fun is seeing how it changes, from the subtropical north to the tropical south or vice versa. And how everything, from the vegetation to the geography to the food, it kind of changes as you go. And I think that you miss that. You miss that nuance when you just fly from place to place. So yeah, while researching the guide, I felt I needed to kind of action that advice. So I didn't take any domestic flights. I try not to anyway, but for this guide, I made a rule that I definitely wouldn't. So yeah, I said I went up and down the country 6 times or something, and yeah, that was all done without taking any domestic flights, and mostly by train, which I really enjoy. And I think that the guide is better for it because it just meant that I got to know the country so much better.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that, I mean, in my years of motorbiking or cycling around places, it's such a different experience from just flying somewhere. And I mean, of course, again, like you said, I recognize that, people come here if they're coming from North America or Europe, they have limited time off. It's a long flight just to get here. And there's a lot to see in the country. So you want to hit as many places as possible. But sometimes, so I lurk on the Vietnam subreddit, and sometimes you'll see people post itineraries for feedback, and it's like, I have 8 days, I'm going to 7 places, north, south, and central, and it's just like, that's a horrific way to see the country. I mean, you're going to spend most of your time going to or coming from an airport, basically.
Yeah, it's not what I tend to recommend. I think it's sometimes difficult to do because you're coming to Vietnam and you think you might never come back.
Yes,
But
sure.
for better or for worse, it's at least in terms of weather, it's not worth going everywhere in Vietnam in one trip because there's no single month where it's nice everywhere in the country. It's either going to be typhoon season in one place or too hot somewhere else. So, like my advice, and I write this in the itineraries section. My advice is I know it's really, really hard to do. So it's kind of, easier said than done. But my advice is is if you have limited time is to stick within a region and focus on regions that interest you the most. And then, if weather's important to you, then kind of work around that. Um, because there are times when, you wouldn't want to be in central Vietnam, like, typhoon rainy season, October, November. You wouldn't want to be there, I don't think. And people that do go there often end up miserable. And I think there are times when you wouldn't want to be in southern Vietnam, like March, April, kind of the very end of the dry season before the rains come. You
Yeah,
don't,
it's
yeah, it's
extremely hot.
extremely hot and unpleasant. And again, people end up miserable. So, like there isn't one month where it's fantastic everywhere really, and with limited time, I think readers will have a better experience in Vietnam. Sorry, travelers will have a better experience in Vietnam if they just stick to one place. But that's my advice. People can choose to follow it or not.
Yeah. And then maybe just briefly before we move on to another question, the use of diacritics. So, the accent in in the Vietnamese words, which again, I know some publications are starting to do a better job about that, but most don't really bother. I mean, I know if you're a Western reader, it doesn't make a difference what you're reading anyway, I suppose. You don't know what they mean, but why did you choose to use them?
Yeah. So almost all, yeah, like you said, almost all of the Vietnamese words in the book use diacritics. So Hanoi doesn't and Saigon doesn't. And that's partly because I think that would just lead to really ugly derivations, like, I don't know, Hanoian or Saigonese or something like that. Using diacritics is going to look really
Yeah.
weird.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, everything else uses diacritics, from the names of dishes to the names of other, most cities and provinces. And yeah, so this was important to me for two reasons. One is that I just really wanted to celebrate the richness of the Vietnamese written form. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. For your listeners that don't know, so Vietnamese is written with an adapted Latin alphabet that uses diacritics or accents to denote vowels and tones. And yeah, Vietnamese, as you know, Mike, has lots of both vowels and tones, which is one reason why it's so difficult to learn.
Yeah. Yes.
But the writing system, I think, is brilliant. It's certainly much better than what we have in English because you can see the word and you know exactly how to pronounce it. But it's also so much easier to learn than the character system that came before it, and it has contributed to Vietnam's impressive literacy rates, um, over the past decades. So yeah, it's kind of my small way to pay respect to the written form of Vietnamese. So that's one reason. But there's also kind of a practical reason why I use diacritics. So, this always sticks in my mind. A Vietnamese linguist, when I was studying years ago, she told me that writing Vietnamese without diacritics is like writing English without the vowels. And, so it's like you get the meaning, but you can usually get the meaning if you're reading it, but it can lead to frustrating misunderstandings. So, like the word chow, like CHAO, that combination of letters, that can refer to 3 or more, different types of food in Vietnamese. So you could have chow with rising tone, which is rice porridge, or you could have like chow, which is no tone, and that's stinky tofu. And you've also got chow with a heavy tone, pronounced quite differently in the South, I know, which means different things depending on the dish. But yeah, like stinky tofu isn't for everyone. And imagine being in a restaurant
Right.
and you want to order some rice porridge because you've got a sore throat, and you point at the word or you write the word without diacritics, and then you get stinky tofu instead of rice porridge. I'm being a bit silly, but the example I give in the book, because I explain why I use diacritics in the book, and the example that I give is sữa chua, which means yogurt, at least in the north, and sữa chua, which means to fix or to repair, like to fix or repair your motorbike or car. And without diacritics, these words read exactly the same, which is like SUA space CHUA. So, like a visitor wouldn't be able to learn how to say these words correctly, right? But they might see them written down on Google Maps or on a sign or something, and it would be very annoying if I'm kind of making a joke. I don't really know if it's that funny, but I say it's very annoying if you're driving a motorbike in the middle of nowhere and you desperately need a mechanic because your bike's broken down, and you type the word into Google Maps, or you write it down and you ask someone on the side of the street, and there's no diacritics, and then you end up in a shop selling yogurt or something.
Yeah, could happen.
Could,
I mean,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, no, it makes sense for sure. But I know, I'm sure Vietnamese readers or people who have a better understanding of Vietnamese will appreciate that. And I think for people's names, especially, I suppose that's particularly important. So there was one other thing, I mean, among others, but one thing I wanted to touch on with the book before we kind of get into some broader tourism stuff. You also have an explainer about ethnic minority groups and how you use the term ethno-linguistic group through the book. Ethnic minority groups, that's something you frequently see in, I think, tourism promotional materials, and Vietnam certainly is proud of its specifically 54 the recognized groups. You always see that number. But I hadn't really seen them referred to as ethno-linguistic groups before. So where did that come from?
So it was, throughout the book, it was important for me to be both precise and fair with my language. So, like, for example, I try not to use the word destination because I don't want readers to understand the places they visit only from the perspective of a visitor. Like a destination is a place you journey to and travel in. But that place isn't a destination for the people that live and work and raise families, And I kind of want readers to appreciate that.
Sure.
And like another example is in the book, I refer to myself as an immigrant, not an expat. Like my understanding of an expat is someone that has a contract for a limited number of years and then they go home or they move on to another country or whatever. And that's not me, and just being white or Western doesn't automatically make me an expat. So, that's not the word that I would use.
Yeah.
And, I think that ethnic minority is kind of similar. So, yeah, I think that you mentioned it. I think that ethnic minority, I think it's the most used term because I think it's a direct translation of the Vietnamese. So like the Dân tộc thiểu số, because that's how you would translate it directly from Vietnamese. So, it's the term that tour guides use, and it might sometimes also be the words that the different groups use to refer to themselves. And, I think ethnic minority, it's certainly better than other terms like, hill tribe, for example, which I think feels, very derogatory and colonial. And I can't believe that you still see it. But yeah, I think, the problems that I have with ethnic minority, So one of the things is that I think most of my readers are going to be from Western countries. And I think that that term means something different in many of those countries. Like, I'm not really sure about the US. You can speak to that. But in the UK, at least, ethnic minority is sometimes used to refer to immigrant communities. So like people that have migrated to the UK in the last, 100 years or so, particularly after the war. But, the so-called ethnic minorities in Vietnam have been around for like hundreds of years.
Mm,
And actually, some have been around for more than 1,000
sure.
years. And many are even the original people, or not the original perhaps, but they're the people that lived in parts of the country before the Vietnamese, or the King, the ethno-linguistic majority, before the King arrived, in central Vietnam or southern Vietnam. So I feel like using the term can be a bit misleading because it might imply something slightly different to people from outside of the country. But, from some perspectives, it's also just wrong, right? Like in the example that I often give is Cao Bang. So in Cao Bang province, which is on the cover of the book, actually, the vast majority of people aren't Ging. They're not the ethno-linguistic majority of Vietnam. Most people in Cao Bang, the vast majority of people in Cao Bang, they're either Day or Nung people. So I don't know, it just didn't really feel right to me to refer to them as ethnic minorities when they're the majority in that part of the country that I'm writing about.
Right.
So yeah, I think ethnic minority didn't say what I wanted it to say. And yeah, I use ethno-linguistic instead of ethnic. Because I don't know, it seems to me like ethnicity is so difficult to pinpoint. I think an anthropologist can talk more about this. I'm not an anthropologist, but I do have a background in linguistics, and so I've always valued language. So it just kind of made sense to me to to kind of wed the language that people speak to their background, their customs, their culture, and so on. So yeah, that's kind of why I have ethno-linguistic instead of ethnic, and yeah, that's why I say group instead of minority.
Yeah, I suppose ethnic minority, I mean, you don't want to overlay social issues from other countries here, but I think it's almost a combination of two words that could be problematic in some contexts. Like, I mean, in the US, I've never heard ethnic minority used at all. I mean, we do say minority groups for certain demographics, but if you were to say, like ethnic food, I think was used in previous decades, but now that would be, I think, frankly, offensive or frowned upon if you were to call Indian or Mexican food or something like that ethnic food. So it is, I guess, a little bit of an odd phrase, even if it is a direct translation of the Vietnamese. So again, it has its own context. But I did find that quite interesting. So I did want to go a little bit beyond the book. I mean, obviously, you've been knee deep in tourism or travel for years now, and it is a topic that you write about frequently and quite well, I must say. You had a story a couple months ago about overtourism, kind of with a focus on Hoi An, for example. But tourism, of course, it's kind of like an unstoppable force in Vietnam at this point. I think it's well on its way to smashing previous records for international arrivals. I know there may be some quibbles with how the numbers are counted because I've never been able to tell whether they count or don't count foreign residents in some of those numbers, but that's neither here nor there. But we are seeing some real, impacts in some areas. We've mentioned Phu Quoc, Hoi An, I see frequently getting complained about at this point. Sapa, of course, has had a lot of, maybe damage is a strong word, but the town center certainly is not the most pleasant place anymore. So what do you kind of make of this? Again, Vietnam's not unique in wanting ever more tourists every year. But what do you make of kind of how things are progressing here?
I think in terms of Vietnam's ambitions to attract more tourists, I think I feel apprehensive, but I, currently I think I only really feel apprehensive for the places that already seem to suffer from over tourism. So like, like you mentioned that article, so like Hoi An, which was the focus of that story, and Halong Bay, as well, places like that. But, I try to be optimistic, like remember that medium-sized countries like Italy, France, Spain, they receive 3, 4, 5 times the number of tourists, of Vietnam. And, Vietnam is a pretty big country comparable to those ones that I've just
Yeah.
mentioned. And there are a lot of places to go. And I know that the country could absorb more people, or I feel like it could, and that this could also be beneficial. And like, so when I'm feeling bad about it, I think about the good examples. So, Phong Nha is probably the best one. Although, some might disagree. But yeah, for your listeners that don't know, Phong Nha is a village outside of a national park, which has become very famous for its massive caves, the biggest in the world, arguably. And it's developed as a place for adventure tourism for international visitors only in the last 15 years or so. And in that time, the industry has generated jobs and helped tighten conservation rules. Like tourism is really helping to lift a town and perhaps even a province out of poverty and conservation mismanagement. And, and at the same time, Phong Nha might be drawing people away from Halong Bay, like also a natural wonder, or Hoi An, which is also in central Vietnam. Or at least it might mean that people are spending less time in those more popular places. So I think my thoughts are that if Vietnam continues to pursue these ambitious tourist targets and everyone is going to go to the same places, then yeah, we've got a problem. I don't think I've ever written like a top 10 places to go story about Vietnam. I've been asked to by editors and I always refuse. And it sometimes means that I lose the story. I usually try and change the concept of the story. But if that's what they want, then I don't want to write it because I'll end up suggesting places that aren't the popular places. And then, like no one's really happy. So yeah, like I think if everyone's going to be going to the same places, then yeah, there's going to be a problem. But, if alongside an increase in tourism numbers, we have newer places to visit, like Phom Nha, like Cao Bang, and they're well managed, and visitors think carefully about where they go and why, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that we'll do okay. I don't encourage visitors to go to Halong Bay or Hoi An just because they feel that they should or because that's what everyone else does. Instead, I make a big point about this, especially about Halong Bay. I really encourage people to think about the experience that they're going to have there and then decide if it's really for them, and then offer alternatives. And I think that they're likely to have a better, I think they're likely to have a better time in Vietnam that way. And, it may also mean that they're not contributing to over-tourism. So, yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see. As they say, or as I say, nothing is inevitable in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's I mean, of course, I will also acknowledge there is inherent irony in tourists complaining about tourists, other tourists being in places. But yeah, you mentioned Phong Nha, and I was there last year for the first time since before the pandemic, and was struck positively by how well things seem to be going there. There's no mega resorts or mega hotels. It's quite striking compared to some of the projects you see proposed or built in. We're really beating on Phu Quoc here, but Phu Quoc or I know Cat Ba's got some big developments going on. But then in contrast, sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say, I mean, I think I know earlier in the year, when I saw you in Hanoi, I talked about Ha Giang, which I don't want to sound like a hipster, but was there in 2013 for the first time when almost nobody was going there. And then I've been twice over the last couple of years and how kind of struck this time in a less positive way by just the convoy after convoy of easy rider tours, which seems to be becoming entirely unsustainable. I mean, also it just looks unsafe. Like I'm kind of surprised there hasn't been like a serious or maybe there have been crashes, but I haven't heard about much. But you just see, I mean, you've been up there, but groups of 50 motorbikes with people driven by Vietnamese, but with usually young Western tourists on the back, wearing poor quality helmets, what have you. It is fun, but I don't know how something like that, like long term, what's going to happen there, because it seems like just more and more people are going, and it is an inarguably, absolutely staggeringly beautiful part of the world. But I don't know how they can just keep piling more of these groups onto like small, sometimes dangerous mountain roads. So I guess there's kind of the two. I didn't mean to turn this into a debate about Phong Nha versus Ha Giang, but kind of the two ends of the spectrum a little bit right now.
Yeah, right. In terms of like kind of newer places and how they've developed over the past decade or so. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're very lucky in Vietnam to have Phong Nha as a model. And I follow travel media quite closely. And, I've never heard the term over tourism. I've never seen the term over tourism used to describe what's happening in Phong Nha. And also, with over tourism, it's important to remember there's always two sides. There's arguably the more important side, which is the locals who are using that word. And then there's, the tourists who are using that word too, which I think is, perhaps less important. But, in Hoi An, for example, it feels like there's quite a lot of tourists using that word. And there are locals who are beginning to be a bit frustrated, but are maybe not protesting, certainly not protesting against tourists like they are in, Barcelona or Venice. Not yet anyway.
Right. Yeah.
But in Phong Nha, it just feels like we're so far away from that, like even though there are quite a lot of tourists coming and going from Phong Nha, I mean, nothing compared to Hoi An, but still, compared to 10 years ago, still so many more. But, I, I don't think that you could ever use that word to describe what's happening there, from either perspective.
No, certainly not. Well, who am I to say from the local perspective, but I don't think so either, at least from what I've seen. Well, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I did want to kind of close with, we don't want to gatekeep here. So if you want to share a few of your favorite places that you've been to over the years, that wouldn't be on the usual itinerary, maybe. What would you recommend to people?
Sure. Okay. Well, okay. Yeah. So, I mean, my favorite cities in Vietnam are on the itinerary because they're the two places I've lived. They're Hanoi and Hue, and those are my two favorite cities. But beyond that, so I mentioned it already a couple of times, I think, but Cao Bang, I think should definitely be on the radar, and is one of the reasons why I requested it to be on the front cover of the book. I think this is a fantastic province to visit, and is also a fabulous alternative to places like Sapa or Ha Giang. And I think that it can be explored in a very special kind of way. Because Cao Bang, I don't know, have you been to Cao Bang yet, Mike?
I have once a few years ago. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
stunning. I mean, it kind of seems like it. I mean, I was just complaining about the convoys in Hajiang. I don't necessarily want that for Cao Bang, but it is like it's similarly staggering scenery from what I recall.
Yeah, well, I think that I feel like Cao Bang is that there's an opportunity for a whole different kind of tourism there, because I think in Ha Giang it's all about the journey, it's about the road trips, and I think that Cao Bang, I think that in some ways there are more opportunities there because. So Cao Bang City, I think, is a very pleasant place. I think it's more pleasant than Ha Giang City, and I think makes a great base for all of these day trips, which are all quite different. Like going to the waterfall Banzop is on the Chinese border is fantastic. And then along the way, there's lots of things to see as well. Lots of things that people miss, I think. There's an ancient stone village. There's a metalworking commune that's famous for its knife makers. And, you can have, a great day just from Cao Bang City, just exploring those things in one direction. But then you go in another direction, you have Pac Bo, which is where Ho Chi Minh re-entered Vietnam. And that's also a fascinating place to visit for all sorts of reasons, and makes a very interesting day trip that's very different from the waterfall day trip. All while being based in Cao Bang City. And hiking is becoming more available as well, which you can book through the more active homestays and hotels. And this is a very ethno-linguistically diverse part of the country. So I think that there's all sorts of like cultural, potentially interesting cultural opportunities there as well. So yeah, Cao Bang has to be one of them. Another one I mentioned already, although this will already be on people's radar, and that is, of course, Phong Nha. I mean, just quickly, I've said it for years, and I still think that the caving tours there are Vietnam's best tourism product, especially the ones offered by Oxalis.
I would agree.
And yes, they're not. They're not necessarily cheap. Yeah, they're not necessarily cheap, but they are good value because of the experience that you get. And there's so many caves and they're all so different. So, like if you're claustrophobic, that doesn't matter. You can go to a cave that's bigger than any room you've ever been in your life, So I think that that's a really special place. And, the village is very pleasant as well. Phong Nha town is very pleasant. And there's an increasing amount to do away from the caves. Another place that I think is somewhat on people's radar, though I think not for the reasons that I would recommend it, is Quy Nhon. which is, it's sometimes kind of billed as like an alternative to Da Nang, or like a smaller version. It's a beach city with a really attractive, clean beach, but very few tourists. I think the city itself is nice, and it's a very pleasant place to hang out for a bit. But the reason why I think it's so special is because of the Cham Towers.
Yeah.
So, up until 500-600 years ago, that wasn't Vietnam, that was Champa. And it was within Champa, it was a place called Vijaya. And the Cham Towers are still there, and they are like truly extraordinary ancient structures. And, barely anyone is there. And, having a day or 2 or 3 moving between the different Cham Towers, I think it makes for a really great adventurous experience. If you like renting motorbikes and driving through rice paddies, it's just magic, because you can move between the different Cham Towers. You can go to one and you see it on top of a hill, and you can explore it and learn a little bit about it if you read my book. And then from that Cham Tower, you can spot another one on the horizon, and you can just like make your way to it.
Yeah.
And then it's a whole different tower with a whole different story.
Yeah, well, those are great. Those are great suggestions. Fong Yan and Queen Yan are 2 of my favorites as well. So we're on the same page there. And so I guess in closing, I mean, when and where can people find your book?
Yeah. Okay. So it comes out on the 21st of August. So pretty soon, and that's both digital and physical versions. The physical version is only going to be available in the UK for the first couple of months, and then I think it will be available from elsewhere. So from the US, I think it's from October, and then other parts of the world as well. Vietnam, I'm not sure yet, but certainly the countries around it, you'll be able to buy it in Singapore, Thailand, places like that. Digital version is available everywhere, of course. And I also have for a while now, I've had a wait list on my website. So, if people want to sign up for that, they'll find out when the book's going to come out. And they'll also get a discount code giving them 25% off. So yeah, if people are interested in getting the book, then they can find all of that information on my website, which is just my name, joshuazukas.com. Although I don't know, maybe Mike, you can put it in the show notes if that's allowed.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'll include that and a few other relevant links in the show notes. No problem at all. Well, Josh, thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I know I always enjoy talking about tourism and, other topics as well with you. But yeah, you've got a lot of good things to say on the topic, so appreciate that. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. I really genuinely appreciate your newsletter and podcast. So it was an honor to be on it.
No problem at all. That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform and tell any interested friends about it. See you next time.